Good evening. My name is Paul Goldsmith. I'm a neuroscientist and one of the Big Tent trustees. And I'm delighted tonight to introduce Canon Sarah Snyder, anthropologist, theologian and mediator, and one of the most skilled, insightful and impactful individuals in the areas of peace and reconciliation. And for those of you who don't know Sarah, she's currently the Archbishop of Canterbury's Special Advisor for Reconciliation, but previously has worked at the United Nations as Director of Partnerships with Religions for Peace International and directed Cambridge University's International Summer Schools for faith leaders from conflict zones. But particularly interestingly, now is founding director of the Rose Castle Foundation, an international centre of peace and reconciliation with both residential and online programmes to address misunderstanding of those whose worldviews differ markedly. So in the first 10 to 20 minutes or so, Sarah's going to update us on some of her recent work, and then I'm going to open it up to a general discussion. Now, one of the reasons we're so pleased to have you here tonight, Sarah, and indeed you all at this event, is so that we can learn best practice and apply it to what Big Tent is doing. Big Tent Foundation was set up in 2017 at a time of extreme political polarisation and dysfunction in this country. And our notion was that if we could bring people together in an appropriate environment and encourage conversations, it would start to break down barriers and people could get an understanding of why others thought a particular way to start to generate some common solutions. And we chose the name Big Tent with this aim in mind. And indeed, until COVID, we held our festivals in big tents. We're now moving on from merely convening those conversations to helping effect change. And our focus is on left behind areas and regeneration, both physical, social and moral. And we've been holding a series of events addressing different aspects of this. And I have to say the discussions have been absolutely fantastic. And we internalize the learnings of these discussions to apply to our projects. So we'd very much welcome any further input as well as any feedback you have in our discussion. So do get in touch. But for the moment, Sarah, over to you.
Thank you, Paul. And it is literally wonderful to see so many familiar faces out there. Hi, everybody. And you're the experts. So I'll talk for a little while and then please just pitch in and you'll have far more to say than I have to say. But first of all, to say that my husband and I started our life, our mediation journey, if you like, our reconciliation journey in a tent, actually. And it was in the Sahara Desert. We were living with the Tuareg nomads and we were there just after Live Aid. And the pictures at the time on our Western televisions were of starving Africans. Do you remember with the begging bowl and the wonderful West popping our money in and making all their suffering go away. And we wanted to put out a program that demonstrated the gift of Africa to the West, the many gifts of Africa to the West. And we chose this area of the Sahara Desert in northern Mali because it was host to 66 different people groups. And they, at the time, which was many years ago, were collaborating in wonderful ways. There was fish being traded for meat, there was milk being traded for millet, etc., etc. And the outlook of these people taught us so much about our own unnamed prejudices. We learned from them about faith, about society, about philosophy, about life, about respect for the elderly, about fashion, about fun, just so much of life that we saw in a new way through what they shared with us. And I think that lies behind most of the work that I've been involved with since. It's recognizing that often we interact with our own stereotypes of those who are different to ourselves. You know, you build a picture of what people are like, and then you live your life according to that picture. And sometimes we never get a chance to meet the real people whose picture we interact with. And of course, that's what we're talking about today, I hope, in terms of left behind communities. It's actually providing spaces and opportunities in which we can really meet and engage with people that we don't normally meet. So I do just want to clarify, I'm not a politician, I'm not a specialist in urban regeneration, I'm not even a social scientist, although I trained as an anthropologist. But at Rose Castle, we have a network of amazing peace builders and reconcilers committed to working across some of the deepest divides within their communities and institutions and nations. some of which are devastated by conflict, some of which are in a pre-conflict phase, some in a post-conflict phase. But particularly we work with faith-based communities because we really believe they often don't have a voice in the public square, and yet they have so much to offer us in the way of peace building, despite being labelled often as the cause of violence. And I can see a few of those network even here today, which is fantastic. So regeneration emphasises whole community engagement. It recognises that collaborating communities are resilient communities. But what I'd love us to think about today is who we miss when we look at our communities, whether they're urban or rural. Who do we overlook, either purposefully or inadvertently? Are we aware of the many and diverse support networks, some of whom operate unfunded and under the radar in our homes, our religious organisations, and our community spaces? Should those networks even exist, do we think? Or are they a threat to the flourishing of our communities? And who decides? This week, I've actually been working with 2 large inner city churches in the US who self-identify as progressive. And that, of course, inadvertently labels those who are different as potentially regressive. One aspect of the progressive outlook is their inclusivity, a welcoming of all, no matter what their background or outlook. Yet, ironically, they exclude those whose views don't match their definition of inclusivity, which often includes the many conservative, with a little c, communities they live alongside. A famous medieval Muslim teacher wrote a little treatise noting the intolerance of the tolerant, which perhaps sums up the views of so-called progressives today. Very often, those of us fully versed and comfortable in the public space are unaware of those whose voices are missing, or we simply overlook them because their views don't sit comfortably with our own. We live in a culture committed to inclusivity, trying hard to identify and address the needs of those on the margins. And yet, because many of us are the ones in the decision-making seats, we're also those who decide who's on the margins. We don't always know who or what we are missing. Take the example of minority faith communities. Regeneration initiatives are tasked with reaching these sometimes hard to reach pockets of society. Yet the normative assumption here in Britain is that religion is a private concern, rightly separated from politics and the public square. Regeneration professionals can be wary or uncomfortable about engaging any kind of faith dimension, fearful of hidden agendas, including proselytization, and in doing so risk missing a vast army of volunteers up and down the country who serve a broad spectrum of public and communal needs. Activities, as we all know, like food banks and night shelters, English language lessons, or after-school clubs, etc. So professionals talk about equal opportunities and targeting left behind communities, yet people of faith see a lack of nuanced understanding of their communities. For many, their religious tradition frames their entire worldview, including their outward-facing and public engagement. A Muslim colleague recently articulated this very simply. For us, religious affiliation and community belonging are one and the same. Our religion is our community. Those with a secular outlook may assume religion is a private affair, but in doing so may be silencing those very people in public, effectively asking them to leave their faith identity as they walk out of their home. Is this simply a clash of worldviews, or is it indicative of a predominantly secular public space, one in which we may not realise who is being silenced or why? So just a couple of quick examples. Here in Britain and across Europe and the States, universities are meant to be places of critical thinking and open debate, to encourage dialogue in which everyone has a say. And yet these very campuses can be so inclusive that they silence the voices of those whose worldview is different. If you hold a conservative opinion on a social issue, whether on sexuality or immigration or religion, for example, your voice may not actually be welcome in the public square. It may be considered antithetical to the dominant liberal secular worldview that reigns on many of our university campuses. And there are, of course, advantages to this worldview, especially its focus on individual human rights. But in asserting an inclusive mindset, we may be inadvertently silencing those who don't share our thinking. A second example is a church here in London who pride themselves on their diverse congregation. That diversity straddles racial and ethnic divisions, liberal liberal and conservative theologies, political and socio-economic differences, to name a few. Recently, they have witnessed a number of families leaving the church and asked if we would support a process of honest conversations across the community. What emerged was really surprising. In light of recent events like Brexit's anti-immigration sentiment and the Black Lives Matter movement, some of the congregation felt misunderstood by their church community. Despite the diversity of families, the norm is that of liberal, university-educated white Christians. They were proud of their diversity and they didn't see or hear problems or divisions in their midst. On hearing the responses of their fellow congregants, they expressed shock and devastation and were quick to offer heartfelt apology. Why didn't you tell us what you were going through? They asked. Surely this is a place where we all know one another. We can share our differences. Well, you never asked, came the reply. Many of whom are from cultures where one doesn't express personal opinion unless asked for it. So what are the questions we need to be asking that we don't yet know to ask? And who in our communities is waiting for an invitation to speak? We live in communities that have many stereotypes. We look out at our communities and naturally we form boxes for people. We think we know who others are, but sometimes we really do only know our image of them. And of course, the media feed into or even inform those stereotypes with headlines like Islamic terrorist, with white terrorists described in other ways like far-right activists. And of course, I'm being provocative here just to get the discussion going, but the tribal nature of our society is real. We have in-groups and out-groups. We understand ourselves by who we're not. And whilst I don't condemn that aspect of human nature, we all do it, it can result in a dangerous othering of people who aren't like us. And back to the left behind, who decides who they are? And would they describe themselves that way? Some of my more conservative Muslim colleagues look at the secular West, for example, those in Oman, where I often go, and they see mounting crisis, soaring mental health challenges, increasing debt, rampant individualism, and a range of societal addictions. This, they would argue, is a left behind part of the world. No doubt we have pockets of these perspectives up and down the country here, perhaps the very pockets others of us might call regressive or left behind. And just to close, up here, our nearest town is Workington, where I'm actually going tomorrow morning for my first vaccine. It's better known for its embodiment of Workington man, exemplifying working class male Brexit voters targeted by the Tories in their election campaign. And it was subsequently this theme credited as the reason for their landslide win in 2019. But Workington in reality is a place of many different communities. How many of the people in Workington identify with the stereotype projected over them? And who coined the label? It was actually a London think tank whose researchers may have never visited Workington before. So on that note, I'd love to open up a discussion around how we define left behind people groups. Is this helpful categorizing in our desire for genuine regeneration of our communities? How can we engage these groups in our decision making, not through token round tables, but in more meaningful, practical ways? Would their vision for regeneration match our own? And how would we respond if they don't? We know that diverse communities who collaborate despite their differences are stronger and more resilient than those in which a homogenous group set the terms of engagement. Yet it's rare to see that kind of collaborative long-term endeavor. So I wonder if it might even be an impossible dream. Over to you, Paul.
Thank you, absolutely wonderful. And it's such a thought-provoking question, who is left behind? Because you're absolutely right in terms of where the misery and discontent is. It is as much in London and with the people who are proclaiming on the other areas. I wonder whether I could sort of begin by actually asking the first question, and it's around narrative, which is sort of so important. Our own personal narratives, which interplay with community narratives. And these are accreted into our psyche from when we're born, and the more deeper set accretions are much harder to change. So it's sort of thinking, what is the process because there's a bit of a cognitive aspect to it, to getting understanding, but how do you really sort of change those sort of deep-seated emotionally linked thought processes? So any thoughts with your anthropology background as well as your practical learnings?
Yeah, and I think, and many of those who are here with us who work in our Rose Castle network would probably say too that kind of change, particularly when you have grown up living either in fear or in under threat by another group within your same community, that kind of fear is very hard to change, but can only be changed by meeting face to face with those people, and in a space in which you feel safe enough to go beneath the surface. So you feel safe enough to ask questions that you wouldn't ask if you were just passing them in the street. So there's a huge amount of literature. Jewish colleagues may well share with me in my love of the Jewish tradition around the face. Levinas has spoken particularly on the power of the face. And when you meet the person you thought you knew face to face, you realize, you see below the surface of that iceberg, and you realize there's a whole part of that person that you actually don't know. And I suppose the response, the right response can be one of curiosity, one of questioning that says, I'd really like to know more, but that's risky and it's hard.
Yeah. Ari Jesner, Chief Executive of the Office of the Chief Rabbi, is with us. I wonder whether you have any additional reflections on that.
Thank you for that, and for putting me on the spot, Sarah. It's lovely to do that, and thank you for the thank you for that presentation. And it's a remarkable thought with regard to face. I mean, when we think of Moses asking to look at God, to see God's face, and being told actually he couldn't, but there is a long tradition in Judaism of the face-to-face collaboration and dialogue, and the very nature of the house of study, where Jewish tradition is developed and has evolved over, literally thousands of years, is all about sitting face to face with your, I don't want to use the term opponent, but with your study partner, and arguing and asking questions, and nothing is left at the door, sort of thing. It's very much firmly part of the tradition. The challenge, of course, always is to then take that outside of the house of study, the kind of internal perspective within your own tradition, which is, Sarah, what you're referring to, those who are like us within our own community, what we might refer to as our own echo chamber, our own bubble today, and be, I suppose, brave enough and bold enough to be able to try and have those same conversations elsewhere, being vulnerable enough to do so, not knowing what the outcome might be and what the responses are. And therein lies one of the challenges with knowing even how to engage. When you sit within your own comfort zone or your own tradition, there's a certain understanding of the expectations and of the etiquettes, and the minute you step out of that and you're going to sit face to face or converse with the other, it does require an openness and a vulnerability, and it's not always easy to do. And therefore the kind of facilitating and creating those spaces where that can be done, always easier said than done, but where that can be done, is so crucially important. And that applies in so many areas, whether it's what we're talking about this evening or wider kind of conflict resolution and all sorts of other areas.
Yeah, thank you.
So it's sort of location process. I wonder whether there's also an element around sort of at what sort of stage one does it in terms of age. And Yasmin Abid, if you're there, you've asked a really interesting question relating to the role of youth, but I'm also interested in your views as to whether that's a more fruitful area in which to start to unpick some of these challenges.
Thank you so much. My name is Yasmin Abid. I'm from Egypt. I had the privilege to know Sarah face-to-face during the Pacemakers Forum, which was held in London 2018. Thank you so much for inviting me in this event. And in the last 5 hours, I was searching about regeneration. It was such a new aspect for me. And I learned so much from YouTube, from websites, but I still don't know how can we apply regeneration concept in our societies, and what role youth should play in this aspect. I think when we speak to each other, when we go to meet people who are different from us in cultures, in religions, we do so. We respect each other's and we know more about their personalities, as Sarah said. And yeah, it was such a great chance to do so during the Pacemakers Forum. But how can we invite more youth to join us in fulfilling such a great aspect in the society? That's my question. Thank you so much.
Lovely to see you, Yasmin. And you remind me of an amazing event I had the privilege of moderating in Jordan that confounds reason, really, but it was the most senior leaders across the Middle East meeting to discuss the engagement of youth in anti-violent rhetoric. And there were no youth around the table at all. And how often our decision makers forget the perspective and role that young people bring. And that's reaching right back into very young ages. I think we've got Anne, are you here from Story Tent? In a minute, I'd love you to come in from the primary school perspective. But young people today are seeing a world that is utterly different to the world that the current older leaders, senior leaders grew up in. And young people today have so much to offer about creative, innovative ways that we can engage in community building, in community engagement, in regeneration projects, etc. And I personally long for this to be a big theme in schools, right the way through schools. And I'm just going to give you one little example of a program that I was running for many years here in Workington, and it was called Allerdale Youth Bank. And the young people who were from ages 9 to 14 were given a grant, a big grant, fairly big grant, and they then made decisions about which community organisations received their grants and how they were going to measure the impact of those grants over the following year. And these young people made spectacular decisions. One's way better than I would have made. I was just the adult who was kind of supervising, facilitating them. But if only we could see more of that in our communities, I think that would be a little example. Youth banks, which are youth making decisions in funding local community initiatives.
You mentioned, was it somebody, Anne, who's a...
Anne, yeah, so you here, Anne.
Really interested to get your thoughts on that, because and it relates to another point that somebody has made in the chat about so much of how we think is so deeply embedded we're unconscious to it. So the earlier we get at that, the better. So how is that possible, Anne?
Sorry to put you on the spot, Anne.
That's okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Yeah.
Okay. So I don't know quite how to answer that question. It seems a very big question, but my experience is actually we've been developing ways of using story with children to help them to encounter the other who's different. So stories from different faith traditions, using a tent to help them to come together for dialogue. And it's been incredibly positive just seeing the way that they embrace difference in a way that often adults struggle with. They don't have a lot of those preconceptions, and the way in which they've developed skills and competences to communicate across difference has been very exciting to see and be part of.
Yeah, and one little example of that was a lad I met with recently, and he was talking about his friend who doesn't eat pork. And actually, it turns out his friend happened to be Muslim, but he didn't see his friend as Muslim. He's his friend who doesn't eat pork, and therefore he was trying himself not to eat pork on the days when he went, or he invited his friend over to his house. So just little examples of ways in which children can change the lens on which we view difference.
Great. Bonnie Evans Hills, if you can unmute yourself, you posed a very sort of important question, and I wonder whether you could offer your reflections on what does regeneration mean? What should it mean?
Yeah, I think this is just something I've been pondering over for a while, mainly with regard to climate change and our response to it, but also going back years. My question was, what do we understand by regeneration? That can mean something different to different peoples and different contexts. I'm thinking of the thinker E.F. Shoemaker, who wrote the book Small is Beautiful. We're going back years. But what he did is he worked in the area of development and doing it in an environmentally sensitive way. And rather than going into an area and saying, oh, this needs doing, this needs doing, this needs doing. Instead, it was about going in, listening to people. What are their needs? What are their priorities? And how can we work with this in a small way? So it's not going in with huge projects that mean nations, are in debt because they've had so much investment going in and they've had to borrow in order to set up all of these projects. No, he worked with people locally, using local resources and with local ingenuity to set up small projects. But that actually helped people to develop, gain greater prosperity or whatever, but it was working with people where they were, listening to people where they're at rather than where we think they should be. So it's very much this face-to-face kind of engagement. And that's true with regard to the climate change, with regard to gender disparity, with regard to reconciliation. It's that face-to-face, where are you? And what do you want?
Yeah, no, and Catherine Matlock is sort of saying something quite similar. And I wonder, Catherine, whether you could share your reflections, because I think it builds on what Bonnie's just said.
Sure. I mean, Paul's just asked me to describe Journey of Hope, because I've put that in the chat. I'm sure Sarah will be very, very familiar with that. So
yeah,
I'm
great.
Privileged to be one of the cohort this year in Journey of Hope, which is a group of us who the organisations that are focused on reconciliation in UK Northern Ireland come together to invite people to look at various different aspects of reconciliation in our communities and across our world. And today we were looking at the environment and reconciliation, and we had some, as happens in every session together, some incredible speakers, but there was one gentleman, and again you may know him, Sarah Bayo-Akomolafe. And he, I mean, it was quite challenging to keep up with the amazing intellectual capacity of that man and the wonderful poetic way he speaks about our attitudes in the world to each other and our ways of working with reconciliation. But something he said that I've put in the chat really challenged me, which was that he said, if we use the terms inclusion and exclusion, then we are still leaving the door and the whole building intact, i.e. we're still saying there is a space where some of us feel at home, I guess, and where we have a choice about whether we let people in or out. So there's a language, there's a psychology, there's a social understanding of the other, and we are still those that are the normative. And a lot of what you're talking about, I guess, in terms of involving children and young people and story and is a way of, and you said earlier on, Sarah, about coming away from roundtable discussions that are about regeneration. I'm involved in exactly that in an outer estate in Birmingham, where the council is saying they want to work in collaborative partnership with local people, but it's all around, it's a roundtable bureaucratic discussion, and to try to enable local people to become involved in a creative way takes out inclusion and exclusion, that's about how do we enable this community to flourish. It's massively challenging. And I don't have any answers, but it's just wonderful to bring these dialogues together.
And one of the, just to say on that, and thank you for sharing that, because a space in which inclusion and exclusion is welcome is a challenging space to facilitate. But part of that facilitation, I think you can maybe a picture of it is hospitality and this idea of being a risky guest of others. So especially in the church, we're often really great at hosting, or we think we're great anyway, at hosting other people and bringing them into our comfortable spaces and feeding people and preaching to people and serving people's needs. But actually to be a risky guest and to be willing to go into other people's spaces, it is much more challenging. And perhaps that's a way of thinking about being in those spaces where exclusion and inclusion can actually come together, being a host and being a guest in the same kind of space.
And if I can just respond to that, yeah, I mean, it's a community cafe where I have found the relationships to be most meaningful. Is that third space, that neutral space.
Yeah.
Where I yes, I'm always the guest actually in that situation, but I guess sometimes I'm hosting the conversation. But yeah, it's those third spaces that are so valuable, and as you say, those hospitality spaces that are so valuable.
Yeah. Thank you.
Siobhan, is it Eke? Is that how you pronounce your surname? Could you share your experiences in this?
Yeah. Sorry, I was just I'm just navigating, trying to do a million things like children to feed. So hi, thank you for the opportunity to share. I'm super passionate about this. I feel like this last year has given us a real time to reflect, to see actually how we can shape education moving forward, because Adnams, the multi-million-pound brewery, and I did a project called Food for Thought, and the tagline was growing food, growing people, growing business. And what we did was we worked with children in primary schools and high schools. We've created our own handbook, which I'll be happy to share with other people. It's a really funkily designed book, but it's really well thought out. And it was about empowering young people to understand how they could turn their passion, whether they like maths or English or creative or YouTube, how they could create their own business within those primary schools or high schools. And they grew food, and they chose what they grew and how they grew it, and they sold it to Adnams. And Adnams then used it in their pubs and restaurants. So these young children were account managers or press people, and they had real responsibility, because they not only did they grow their own food, they got sponsorship because they had to fund their own business. So they learned how to write letters, to win-win letters to large corporations who sponsored them. And they just got some real skills and understanding for life. And we had a list of schools who wanted to take part, but ultimately the funding wasn't there long term, and it's really, really sad. And then I did another project funded by the Norwich Freeman with a regular high school, and these young people came up with a vision to develop some, there's a dilapidated piece of land in the city, and they identified that, and they said, why can't we create a really eco-friendly, inclusive, multi-generational space where young people and old people could come together? And we worked on that project for 2 years. And then we approached the city council here in Norwich, and they're now part of that 2040 vision. But the problem is we don't reach out to schools and young people enough. We're just it's an industrial system that is very functional childcare, but we're not tapping into this talent. And I think if we don't give young people the opportunity to air how they feel and to develop these skill sets, which have so many benefits, how are they going to take ownership of their own environment, both near and far? And I truly believe, as Sarah said, they have the ability to do so, and everybody learns and everybody benefits. We just have to find a way to make it part of the existing system, because if schools aren't tasked with developing these skills and it's all about grades, unfortunately, it gets diminished and put to the side. And I think we are missing so much.
Thank you.
Can I come to Mark Essex next? Whether this is things with children or with adults, inevitably when there are differences of opinion, it partly reflects the fact that there are going to be trade-offs, and people don't like trade-offs, so it's not often addressed. Mark, can you offer your reflections and potential solutions?
Yeah, my question looks a bit small in the scheme of the big things we're facing, but it's meant to be an example that it seems to me that when we try and change places, things get blocked. And our research with Demos on the future of towns said that places are divided, and what might appear to you or I as obvious, no-brainer things that places should want You know, we would like our place to be somewhere our young people would like to stay rather than leave, and not things which are universally welcomed. I mean, places are quite divided on that sort of question. You know, in principle, sure, why wouldn't we want our youngsters to stay? But as soon as you say, well, we'll have to attract employers and colleges and the sort of things young people need, people start to think, well, hang on a minute, I quite like my outlook and so on. And it strikes that what we end up with is weak consensus, that which is not blocked. Nobody objects to cleaning up graffiti. No one objects to clearing up litter. But as soon as you start saying to people, would you like to pay more for that to happen? People would like an independent high street, but not enough to not order from Amazon and actually shop in their independent high street and pay 30p more for a bag of sugar. And so it strikes me that we have a failure of leadership, really, that the things that people think they want and aspire to are not the things they encourage to happen through their behavior. How do we get more alignment either between groups and people in towns such that we don't end up with either paralysis or oscillation, either of which prevent any business investing in any place, anywhere, or even within people with their own internal conflict about the vision that they have for their place, and are they doing what they can to make it come about with the choices they make? I think towns are divided and people are divided, and I diagnose it as a failure of leadership, but that's just my hypothesis. What do you think?
Mark, thank you. And you know, you and others here will have more to say on this than me, but a few thoughts. And they really go back to what we've talked about a little bit earlier, that change comes through experiencing the issues firsthand. So, you know, when we have a view about, for example, young people in our communities, it's all very well if they're our young people and we know them, but if they're other people's young people and we don't know them, there's an immediate kind of suspicion of, well, how are they going to change my community? Will I like them here? Or will they be noisy? You know, will they make me feel uncomfortable in my own space? So one of the thoughts is just around providing those opportunities for encounter between existing homeowners and aspiring homeowners. You know, being able to meet face to face, to within their own community, to break down some of the stereotypes of one another, and to jointly and creatively explore answers to a very real crisis. In other words, the challenge of where people without a home might live within that community, or whether in fact they need to be excluded from that community. So something about the opportunity for face-to-face encounter, and that's easier said than done, but it is possible to find those kind of spaces, to open up those kind of spaces. And then, you know, just another thought, very, very small thought, but practical, is being given examples of where it's already worked, you know, and looking at some of the great examples, whether it's Singapore or other country contexts, or whether it's within our own community, where in fact a change in housing provision has actually led to a more collaborative or a more resilient community, or even a more beautiful landscape in that community. And another thought would be just thinking, recognizing that there are very practical needs where many of us are looking for within our homes. You know, working from home at the moment means many people want a bit of space for a desk, a quiet space in the home, and they haven't got that. Other people might be focused more around having grandchildren to stay, or friends to come and spend a night with them and to feed them and give them hospitality. So there are real needs, and they need to be put on the table. You know, how can we provide for those kinds of needs that many of us want, and often go unspoken under the banner of, well, we just need housing, that's all we need. But actually, what do we use our houses for, and what do we want to do with our homes, and how can we do that in ways that enable others also to be part of it? And then, you know, the only other thing is that kind of bird's eye view of lifting above my street or my village or my outlook, and being able to see the potential for green space and community amenities in amongst the homes that we already have, and how there might be more possibility for that, even with a greater degree of housing being brought in. So those are just a few little examples.
Really interesting, and so much of what we're talking about, it seems, is providing insights into the way both we ourselves and others think. Yet a lot of the emphasis has been more on behaviour. And Rory Sutherland, given that you head up a behavioural insights team, I wonder whether you have any reflections on the sort of processes that we could bring to bear to some of the problems that we're discussing tonight.
Yes, I think bottom-up experimentation receives far too little attention compared to top-down generalized solutions. And I think that seems to be something really vital. There's a great book actually by an anarchist anthropologist called James C. Scott called Seeing Like a State. Until I read this book, it never really occurred to me how extraordinarily detached and strange the view of people is once you actually aggregate all the data and the information. And so I think there's definitely work. And actually, of course, it didn't really occur to me how incredibly alien much of the language of politics and economic and legal discussion is from everyday concerns. But sometimes the good news of behavioral science is that sometimes, and I even apply this to things like polarization of opinion in online social media, I'm not sure that the solution might not be a lot easier and simpler if people were just prepared to experiment with oblique solutions rather than direct ones. Someone observed to me that actually Facebook and Twitter only really turned nasty when someone invented the like button. And so it occurred to me that maybe something as simple as not necessarily removing the like button, but some similarly minimalistic intervention might make a really big difference.
Actually, Rory, on that note, our daughter long ago suggested that alongside the like button, there was an opposite view button. And so you could then have pitching in somebody with a totally out of the box view to yours, and how wonderful that would be for breaking our social bubbles online.
Exactly. If there's something exactly like that would be perfect.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Before coming to Wendy May, because I'm really interested in your views, Wendy, Lewis Atkinson. Lewis, if you could unmute, because you've come up with a potential way forward addressing one of the points that Mark made.
Yeah, hi Paul, and thanks for having me. I'm by no means an expert, but I think the issue Mark raised about how do you get communities to engage in trade-offs, for example, about how to fund services or how to choose to prioritize working or spending money on such a thing rather than another thing. I'm aware, but I've observed from afar with interest about work on participatory budgeting. It's a movement that started, I think, particularly in Brazil, and has been attempted in several places in the UK. But as I said, I'm by no means the expert. But I think it's really a way of trying to get citizen trust into the process. I mean, when I work, I think in particular with councils, anyone that does work with councils, if you put out communications from a council, you're really surprised about the amount of just background distrust that I think normal people have on local bureaucracies. I mean, you might think that's unfair, and I often think it's really unfair, because I think often there's good people trying to do their best with very, very stretched resources, but participatory budgeting strikes me as a way of trying to rebuild some of that trust through engagement and involvement. But I think you've got to do it really at a very local level. So, trying to think about how do you regenerate such and such a town is probably not granular enough. And how do you start building trust in almost micro communities and build and then wondering whether you could aggregate up from there?
Really interesting. So it's talking again to sort of the point that Rory made. It's sort of going very bottom up, and when people are talking about taking back control, it's to what level? Is it to the region? Is it to the town? Or is it getting right down to the village or street level? Really, really interesting, I think important. We talked a lot about education, which is so important in children. Wendy, do you have any reflections on some practical things that could be done?
I think one of the big problems is that we, as somebody once said when I was working in a school, that we're still trying to teach children with 19th century methods. And I was listening the other day to a school, head of a school in Holland, where children come in and they are asked what they want to do, what they're interested in, and then they enable them to do it. So, for example, if there's a particular aspect of science they're interested in, then they may need to learn English in order to be able to pursue that particular aspect. And in that way, they guide their own learning. And I know this may not work in all schools, but I think that if we encourage young people to say more what it is that they want out of education, and rather than teaching them to get through exams, to educate. And I think this is one of the great advantages of the public school system, where they have a range of newspapers and are expected to, and hope that they will read them. Whereas in a state school, you don't have that luxury. It's just education, and I think we could do it better. And I think if you do it better that way, then you encourage young people to think in different ways. And if they think in different ways, they will think outside the box, as a lot of other people have been talking about.
Fantastic. Chris Langdon, you're asking whether the move to online is a help or a hindrance. I mean, it offers fantastic events like this, and I'd be interested, Sarah, to see how you're progressing things at Rose Castle, where you're doing a mix of online and face-to-face. But before, Sarah, you were offering your views. Chris, what are your thoughts?
Well, obviously, it's much more fun meeting face-to-face, but it's not possible at the moment. And it seems to me there are opportunities. I certainly worked with the LSE, and we've talked about how democratizing it is. You can have not just the conversation with people who could get to a meeting at the LSE, but it globally. So there are opportunities, but I'm very interested, Sarah, when one wants to have very profound discussions about really meaningful issues and reconciliation. Have you developed the means to do that, to translate from the face that you were talking about so elegantly, as was Ari, to the virtual?
Yes, and I'm so pleased you asked us, and we may have Hannah here as well from our team, who's been a big part of this. But you know, the move to online has been a complete blessing for us on the Rose Castle team, because we initially have always prioritized face-to-face in real time. The meal table is particularly important to us in a mediation context. You don't sit around a meal table with your enemy. And so even the first evening, having a meal is a significant step when you're bringing together communities who totally misunderstand each other, or very often are even acting violently, speaking violently towards one another. What we've found in the online space is that because you've got the power of the face, because you can still see each other face to face, in some ways you can see each other even more intimately than you can in a residential space. And you are seeing each other often in, apart from your background here today, but often you're seeing each other in the home, in your home environment. So you've got a much more intimate insight to someone, even if it's very partial, in their own natural, comfortable environment. And what we've done is we've created all sorts of different spaces for encounter using different platforms, like Miro is one of them. And actually, the team created a virtual Rose Castle, which has got spaces, so intimate spaces where you sit around a fireside, you know, all virtual. Workshop spaces where you're learning, somebody's teaching and you're learning. We've got meal tables where you literally sit around a table and have a conversation. We've got outdoor spaces where you can go 2 by 2 for walks and you're actually talking on the phone or WhatsApp call. All sorts of we've got timeout spaces where you go and you just want to think for a while, and that's fine. And then you've got yeah, you're encouraging a different kind of interaction between people. You're breaking people up into small groups where they can talk in ways that they wouldn't talk in plenary, but you're feeding that back into plenary in appropriate ways. So I would say that what the online space has allowed us to think about is, how do you build trust digitally in a digital environment? And particularly, how do you build trust between people who are highly suspicious of one another? And it's far more possible than I would have dreamt of just 18 months ago.
Fascinating.
So, yeah.
And how will you, sorry, I have a background because my office is so messy. But how will you do this in a world maybe a happier world when COVID is reduced, at least if not eliminated? Will you think about going forward with your work that's hybrid, a bit of both in the future?
Yeah, what we're thinking is that you don't want to lose the physical encounter. There are still so many advantages of that offline space where most of the work, the good work, is done out of the classroom, if you like. So it is done actually around the meal table or sitting up at night, or for those who get up for that early morning cup of tea, you know, they have those surprise encounters. So we don't want to lose that. But when those people go back to their homes, how do they continue to support and teach and model for one another, be there for one another? Well, the best way to do that is through this ability to continue to engage online. And you know, they can do that themselves just by a one-on-one, peer-to-peer type meeting, or they can arrange bigger group reunions where they can share some of their best practice, share their worst practice, and learn from each other. Or we can then get them hosting new groups from within their own communities, bringing them into a space so that there's some from one cohort introducing a new cohort into that space. So being able to have a mix of the two, I think, is going to be far more powerful than just one or the other.
Thank you. I agree.
And I think, and the lack of or being able to see the messy background helps normalize and make things more approachable. And this has all been studied intensively with cognitive behavioral therapy in the medical area, delivered digitally, and the evidence base is very, very good. So it really does work online, providing there is the sort of the face contact as well. Naheed, if you are still online, you, I think, had a sort of an interesting reflection about how you would direct particular activities, Naheed.
Yeah, I have to leave in a few minutes. Unfortunately, I've got children to pick up. But I was just going to say, I've got my son. He's 22 years old, and he is in his final year of primary school teaching. And I would say, from a very passionate and really, really inspiring young lad, that from going into the school and this being a lifelong ambition of his, he has entered his final year now completely, I think devastated is the word I would use. His experience.
Oh, I think we lost you.
Yes.
Oh, hopefully you might be able to return. If not, Kathleen Smith, are you online?
Yeah. Sorry, I went off mute.
Oh, you're back.
I was just going to say, yeah, it's just devastating for us to watch that somebody who's so passionate and had a lifelong ambition of wanting to be a teacher. And I would add, in this country, has now in his final year has been absolutely devastated. And the impact on that mentally on him, that he has gone into teaching for the children, and he's realized that it's the system that is wrong. He's not able to do what he wanted to do for these children. He's been abroad, he's been to Camp America, where he's interacted with children, and it's not about just speaking to them, it's interacting with them and teaching them life skills that are going to develop that education. He works for a charity called Everton in the Community, where they take youngsters out into the community and make them, say, do up old huts, taking down graffiti, helping their neighbours, all these kind of things, which he believes is what education is all about. And the only, would I say, relief for him is unbelievably that he has his last 6 weeks now, he's gone into another placement and he's gone into a faith school. And he's the only, so he's gone into a Catholic school as a Muslim male teacher, and he said this has changed his views a little bit for the better because of, I don't know whether it's because it's a faith school, that's why, but he said the morals and the way the children have been brought up is completely different to what he has experienced in other schools. So that's just my point across, and he's working with, 5, 6, 7-year-olds. And he said they seem to have a different kind of respect. And for example, he just came home a couple of days ago and he said, I walked into the classroom and there was a young child who was on the iPad, and I went to talk to him and he put the iPad down and started communicating with him. For him, that is a big, that is something obviously the child has either learned at home, but it's brought out that he's got respect for the teacher who's talking to him because he's managed to put down the iPad and have eye-to-eye contact and listen to what the teacher's saying. But yeah, I mean, my experience, as I said, I can only speak from my son's point of view, that it's been absolutely dreadful to for someone to have gone into the education system and to be so absolutely devastated after 3 years that he wanted to give it up, but not give up as in teaching, but give up in this country to get the education for this country, and now decide to go that, I need to go abroad, I can't teach in this country, because he's not going to be allowed to do what he wants to do for the children. So I just thought I'd make that point across before I leave.
And if you've still got a minute, what sort of changes do you think should be made, or your son thinks should be made?
He feels that the teacher, they need to, I mean, this is how I've brought my children up. They need to be taught and interacted with on an equal footing. Children should be your best friends. It shouldn't, to an extent, it shouldn't necessarily be that, I am the adult and it's asking children, what do they want to learn? How do they want to learn? It's not dictating to them, and sitting there with timetables every single day. It's having interactive games, challenging them, taking them outside. He had one example where he said, when he was in Camp America and they were sitting in a classroom, and he said and these are, 12, 13-year-olds, he specifically asked for an underprivileged camp, and he said they had no interest at all on wanting to learn, and he said to them, okay, let's go outside. So he took them outside for half an hour, running around, doing things with them. And just that little half an hour of going outside, they came in and they were ready to go again. So it's asking children what they want. It's not, it's this dictatorship that we've got, and it's all about grades and, that you have to do best. And also, I think it's a parenting skill as well. It's about, as from a parent's point of view, it's not saying when a child's coming home to you and saying, okay, I came third in the class, it's not dictated to them, okay, congratulations, you came third. It's about, well, why didn't you come first?
So this seems an exact parallel with what's being discussed at adult level, with solutions imposed on communities rather than generating solutions at the micro level, but just being it's sort of embedded in our culture and in education as well. And some of this echoes some of the previous Big Tent events we've had, and particularly what Jonathan Haidt was saying. If I can come to Kathleen now, Kathleen Smith, in terms of how to ask the right question.
Yes, I'm from a faith-based culture where we've probably got ourselves backed into a corner where I'm not supposed to say what I'm going to say, which is that we've become so gender neutral and finding things so inappropriate to say and bringing male and female together, that often the voice of, and I'm not speaking for men here, I'm just saying there is a voice for women that we've silenced ourselves. And I've just finished a research project in working and developing a chaplaincy where I work with women who are in aid and development, as I used to be in the Peace Corps, who were suddenly out of the blue with no training, finding ourselves in disaster relief work. And some of the conversations that in the research project that came out was that, Kathleen, it was just too embarrassing to say to these wonderful guys who were working in disaster relief this is over 9 different countries, and different cultures of inclusion, across gender lines. They said they were doing such a wonderful job. It was just too embarrassing to have the conversation in the assessment when they said, what do you need? And then so many of the aid workers were wondering why the women weren't coming out as per normal to run certain food banks, certain functions, certain meals and stuff. And it's because they were hygiene projects that were missing. But it was just too embarrassing to have this conversation. So it made me think. I'm the expat here, I think today, there may be others, but I'm long-term and I have loved being in this country. And my work is assisting people going from one culture to another. And how do we take questions that are happening in one culture, where there's a female culture where conversations are happening among women, and they're not happening so much in gender neutral cultures. And so when we're transitioning from one culture to another, what questions are we not asking? And when we're in the British culture, I've been in London working with a variety of groups, and particularly in the East End, and my kids are in Camden. And just makes me wonder if generationally even, and now they're, they're in their 20s and working in different projects in Camden, what questions are we not asking? What are we embarrassed to ask because it's just not okay anymore to cross some gender lines? We have to be gender neutral. And I'm not saying have to be, but sometimes we make ourselves. So
I might just share a couple of quick stories if it's time, Paul.
Please do. I was going to ask you.
It's going to go help. Sorry.
One from way back when I was 18, and then one from literally this year.
Yeah.
When I was 18, between school and university, I lived with the Maasai. I was working with Tear Fund actually, but I lived with the Maasai in the Kenyan Rift Valley. And I was on my own there for 6 months in this village. And there were all sorts of practices that were different from the ones we have in Britain, including marrying young girls to older elders in the village, and a practice in which young men, actually as part of their manhood initiation, could put their spear outside the hut of a younger girl in the village, and everybody knew everybody, and they could effectively spend the night with that girl. And I was sharing a hut with one of the girls, so I witnessed this and the fear actually that she had. But the memory is this: dust in the distance, and this long line of land cruisers, 10 or 11 of them, coming along and into the Manyata, the little community that I was in, out of which got a lot of American ladies who were from the UN Decade of Women. And they came to announce this inauguration of the Decade of Women by telling all the girls in the village, gathering them, that they really didn't need to marry the older men in the village. This was actually not part of their human rights. And so they gave this little speech, and then they got back in their land cruisers and off they went. And this was way back in 1988 or 9, I can't remember.
Yeah.
But I was left with my jaw kind of on the ground, and the girls in the village were all saying to me, "Oh, so is that what you all think then?" And then they said, "So what does that mean for us?" And it was just the kind of culture clash around gender norms, around societal norms that we face every single day in our career. And I face these questions all the time. If I'm in Oman, I'm sitting with women in a conversation, a dialogue, because I can't be present in the men's space because it's men only. So there's a gender separation that goes on there. The thing that's a bit more relevant to what you were saying is we've just hosted a 5-continent scriptural reasoning event for quite conservative Muslims, Orthodox Jews, and evangelical Christians, and others as well. But on the first session, some of the Pakistani members of that event asked what the label on the Californian participants' screen was that said he, him, or she, her. So the Californians said, well, don't you know? We have all got, everybody has that. And they said, no, we never seen that before. And what emerged was this actually quite beautiful explanation that came, and the absolute jaw-dropping of the Pakistanis who had no understanding of the world that their Californian counterparts were living in. And I say it was beautiful because it was done very sensitively and respectfully. They were able to share in a way that didn't sound like it was don't you have this too? Which was the way it began. But cultural agility is something that we all need, and we need that in our communities here in Britain. We need it in every job, whether we're in a workplace or in a community space. This idea of cultural agility, which as an anthropologist, I would say is about recognizing a very different lens through which others are seeing the same situation that we're looking at. And instead of judging that lens, being really curious about it. You know, how are you seeing this space? And actually, how are you seeing me? You know, because I think I know what you might think of me, but I haven't ever asked you, what do you think of me in the way I present here in this space? And those are sometimes difficult conversations to have, but they're the honest conversations that are needed if we're going to build resilience across cultural lines. Because without that ability to understand how we see each other differently and to respect that difference, we won't be able to work in that kind of shoulder to shoulder way that actually respects difference. It doesn't seek, you know, synergy all the time.
Thank you, Sarah. That's very helpful.
Yeah, Sarah, those are fantastic, really sort of closing remarks. I'm going to wrap things up now, but you have ended with some absolutely wonderful insights. And indeed, everybody tonight, you know, thank you all so much, because this is everybody contributing to our shared knowledge. And this helps us take things forward. I think people will have learned tonight from each other. Certainly within Big Ten, we will write things up, we'll share the commentary with others, and in terms of our future projects, we will include all of these insights in what we take forward. And as I said at the beginning, would really welcome people's help and assistance in whatever way you can in those projects. So do get in touch. I think you'll have Georgie's contacts. And again, I think a particular thanks to Sarah for really sort of introducing and providing so many very helpful and inspiring insights tonight. Good evening, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Good night.